Friends, would you take a breath with me? Begin with another reading called The Seven Principles of Spiritualism. Number 1, the fatherhood of God. The core belief of the religious philosophy of spiritualism is the acceptance of a divine energy. This force, whatever name given to it, has created all there is and sustains all its creation. The Spirit of God exists within and around everything. Number 2, the brotherhood of man. We are all part of the universal creative force and therefore one family in God. The operation of true brotherhood throughout the world would create betterment to the lives of many, bringing equality, security, and peace. Spiritualists try to understand the needs of others and help all people regardless of race, color, or creed. Number 3, the communion of spirits in the ministry of angels. Communion with divine energy is a natural and essential part of existence. Between spirit itself and its creations is an inbuilt ability to communicate. Spiritualists use this ability for communication directly or via medium between the physical and the spirit world and ourselves. Number 4, continuous existence of the human soul. That spirit is a part of the creative force and thus continuous and indestructible. Number 5, personal responsibility. We have the ability to make decisions throughout our lives as we see fit. What each of us makes of our life is our choice. Responsibility, no one can replace or override that right. No other person or influence can put right our wrongdoings. Number 6, compensation and retribution hereafter for all the good and evils done on earth. This principle expresses the natural law of cause and effect. This law operates now on earth as well as in the spirit world. And as we move through life making choices, the outcome of those choices affects our soul's growth. When we leave this earthly life, there will be no divine judgment. We will have the opportunity to reassess, take stock, and decide what might have been done differently. And number 7, eternal progress open to every human soul. Eternity does not begin at death. Progress is open to all now. There will always be the opportunity to develop and move forward. No one is ever deprived of the all-embracing love of God. Here ends the reading. This gives us a little bit of the context for spiritualism, one of our topics for today. So to understand how spiritualism started in this country, we have to go back to 1848, to the antebellum North and South, and set the context that would allow spiritualism to flourish and grow. It's in the period of a time called the Second Great Awakening, when a period of religious fervor swept across North America, especially in the form of white European Christianity. There were barn-burning sermons and hell-raising sermons and circuit riders and Christianity sweeping across the European frontier. Notably, amongst those preachers moving west and south were Universalist preachers. Some of our most famous UU theologians and forebears were part of the Second Great Awakening. Someone that we might draw attention to and might draw inspiration from was Emanuel Swedenborg. He's one of the two men who set the stage for spiritualism. Emanuel Swedenborg experienced mystical visions and started to describe what he witnessed as the spirit world, a world that was adjacent but not quite connected to our own physical world. And the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg opened the doors and set the stage for the visions and the new way of understanding life that would become part of the spiritualist vocabulary. And the second person was Dr. Mesmer, who was a French or German scientist who introduced the term mesmerize, who found a way to introduce hypnosis and induce people into hypnotic trances. His instinct was to help heal and cure them of various diseases. But it's those two ideas, the evidence of a spiritual world beyond this one, described by Swedenborg, and the ability to enter a trance-like state through hypnosis or mesmerism, that laid the foundations for spiritualism to begin to grow. On March 31st, 1848, in upstate New York, what was known as the Burned Over District of the state of New York, where religious fervor had swept through during the Second Great Awakening, the time was ripe for a new religious philosophy. Young Kate and Margaret Fox were in their house, and under the direction of their older sister Leah, they started playing a game where they would knock on a table. Pretty soon, they started hearing knocks back. They looked around and said, "Did you do that? No, no, no. Did you do that? No, no, no." They started experiencing more sounds, things they couldn't explain. At the same time, a few miles away, Frederick Douglass was helping to publish the North Star newspaper, and the Underground Railroad was humming along, delivering people from bondage into freedom, north into Canada and into the northern states. While the evidence of spiritualism seemed to be a little suspect, the workings of Frederick Douglass in the North Star were plain and evident for all to see. But it's interesting that these two phenomena happened in roughly the same place, and how they start to intersect radical politics, freedom-loving peoples, and the spiritualists, those who engage in seances that invoke tappings and rappings and noises seemingly coming from the spirit world. The Fox sisters began to develop a system to understand the knocks and the raps that they were hearing in their room. They started to decipher the language and the meaning using a kind of alphabet code system. And people started to come from miles around to listen to them and to hear what was happening, to see what was happening. And a lot of it could not be explained, and many people tried. Spiritualism that started in this barn in upstate New York and flourishes into this religious society that spreads the globe. It becomes not just a progressive religious force, but also a political force that touches the lives of everyone from Harry Houdini and Cornelius Vanderbilt to Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. And in fact, Philadelphia becomes the de facto capital of spiritualism. Lots of folks gather here, including in one of our Universalist congregations. As we heard in Sandy's reading, the spiritualists took over the Kensington congregation and actually succeeded in taking it out of the Universalist context. So the question for us today is why and how? Why did spiritualism take hold, especially in Universalist congregations? Why did it seek out Universalist and Unitarian circles, radical Quakers, and other multicultural intentional spaces of the 19th century? And you may be wondering, why are we spending any time talking about it? This totally unreasonable, illogical, very un-Unitarian, we might think. Is it humbug? Is it too early to say that before Christmas? Does it sound like hogwash? Does it sound like a fairy tale? Well, today's thesis is this: that we have very much in common with the 19th century spiritualists, and that they ought to be welcomed into this congregation where they alive today, because we have a vein of spiritualism running in our congregational DNA. And I want to invite you to entertain the possibility that their religious practice was in fact grounded in reason and science, in personal choice and freedom, in communal responsibility and systemic change. some of the things we hold most dear here at UU Mount Airy. So ready? Let's dive in. First off, we're talking about why. You got to remember this context. The Second Great Awakening, the 1840s, 1850s, happening in the background. The national tension is ratcheting up over the issue of human bondage and slavery in America. Culminating in the Civil War in less than 10 years, the advancement of that tension and the political forces that are vying, trying to figure out what do we do about slavery. That's always in the background. Secondly, it's a period of post-enlightenment and the age of scientific advancement. And one of the newest forms of communication that revolutionized the world and allowed people to communicate over vast distances in the blink of an eye at the speed of light, seemingly like magic. A little something called the telegraph. If you're not familiar with the telegraph, it's a machine that produces a series of beeps and taps and raps and sounds that is translated into language and communicates over vast distances. That would be pretty magical if you had never seen it before. So in this age of ratcheting tension and scientific advancement and scientific thought process, doesn't it make a little bit of sense to hear from spirits that provide instruction and advice on how to lead a country, how to promote social change, what to do about the issue of slavery, and communicate across vast distances from the spirit world to the physical world? If you can communicate with the American West using a machine like the telegraph, doesn't it make sense that you could use a similar technology to communicate from the spirit world to the physical world? It does make rational sense, despite what our rational brains try to tell us when we hear the word spirits. As the American Civil War takes root, the grief and the loss, coupled with the hope of scientific advancement, is also in the background. This is where it gets interesting. It gets interesting here because when we think about spiritualism, we don't often think of it as an exercise in grief, practice, and management. But for the hundreds of thousands of folks who were affected by loss and death in the Civil War, death was ever present. So in a time when so much grief is so present, doesn't it make sense for families to try and contact their loved ones who were taken by the war, by the horrors of slavery? And as men in charge of the country continue to let slavery run rampant, doesn't it make sense for radical organizers and leaders to reach out to the beyond to try and convince the men who are still living that the leaders who have passed on want them to change course, to do something about slavery, to give spiritual authority to the women who are leading the way on abolition, women's voting rights? If the living men won't listen to the living women, you might say, maybe they'll listen to the used to be alive men. And as to why it took hold in Universalist and Unitarian churches, well, it shared similar beliefs, similar attitudes, and similar progressive values. It makes a certain kind of sense that spiritualism would cross denominational lines and find those engaged in the political works of the day. Because if you think about it, isn't it spirits that tell us what's right and what's wrong, that guide us towards progressive values, that help us want to be better people, right? It may not be an angel or a devil sitting on our shoulder, but it is something that calls to us, calls us to work for justice. As Sandy said, this time of year is the time to get acquainted with those spirits, with the reality of death, with the reality of grief, and with the hope of something more, something that speaks to us, that calls to us, that invites us to engage in practice. Over the past 18 months, we have all become too familiar with grief and death and loss. All all of us have been touched by it, much like the burned over district of upstate New York before and after the Civil War. These days of the year are times when the veil between the physical world and the spiritual world is said to be thin. A time to wrestle with grief and change. A time to heal trauma. I wonder what it would be like for us today to have rituals like the spiritualists had. Ways to deal with grief. I think they were onto something. I think that the core function of religious community is to help us find meaning in life and to find peace with death. Isn't it? So why not take it head on like they did? As always, I'm not trying to convert you to the reality of the rappings and the tappings and the table tippings. I'm not trying to make you believe something that you might think is fantasy. I'm asking you to open your mind and your heart to hear what is new, what new learning might be found. I'm asking you to be in relationship with different theologies, not because I think that they're better or worse, but because I think they speak to the human experience in ways that resonate. Because I don't believe that anyone is not spiritual or not religious. I think to be human is to be both spiritual and religious, naturally. But that doesn't mean I'm here to make you believe in ghosts or to pray or meditate or fast or what have you. Your spiritual practices are yours. But I think spirituality is your orientation to the rest of existence. It's what you use to make meaning in the world. And I think religion is the vocabulary of word and action that we use to express that orientation, both as an individual and as a community. So friends, in that sense, we are all spiritualists, finding our way home together. Some of us rap and tap. Some of us tip tables. Some of us call out to God, and some of us sit in silence. Friends, on this Hallow Eve, may we heed those spirits that call to us. Be they the spirit of justice, of peace, of light, of freedom, of life, or the spirit